Hello, and welcome to User Experience Design for DriveWorks. This presentation is for anyone who wishes to learn more about how to make their DriveWorks implementation more user-friendly and more user-focused, ultimately leading to a more successful implementation. My name is Joseph Caswell, and I am a technical solutions consultant at TPM, a DriveWorks reseller based in the Southeast US. It is my job to consult with a variety of customers to guide them to a successful DriveWorks implementation, and in many cases, I am directly involved with bringing their DriveWorks projects to life. Don't worry if you have no idea what UX is or what it entails. This presentation will go over just that. We are going to take a high-level overview of the UX design process from cradle to grave. We'll go over UX design, UI design, and accessibility, what they all are and why they are important. Then we'll walk through the design process step by step and showcase some of the tools of the trade along the way. So let's get started. What is user experience design? UX design is the process of designing a product from the perspective of the user. You may have heard of DFM, or Design for Manufacturing. That is the process of taking a look at your products and seeing how you can modify them to be better for manufacturing. This isn't all that different. Instead, we're going to be looking to see how things can be improved for the user. UX specifically is focused on the entire journey or experience of the user, not just the interface. UX design is the process of creating products that provide meaningful and relevant experiences to users. It involves designing with the intent to integrate aspects of branding, design, usability, and function. UX designers help make technology easier to understand and more enjoyable to use. Let me bring this back to engineering. Before you can design the door handles of a car, or the dashboard, or even muffler, you need to know what, or rather who, the car is for. What is the car supposed to make the driver or passengers feel? A Ferrari supercar is going to be a very different experience from a Chrysler minivan, and every aspect of the design should reflect that. Failing to consider this leads to a bad user experience, which means unhappy customers. What about UI? What's the difference? User interface design is the process of designing the individual interfaces that make up the product. In our case, this will be the forms and controls that make up the DriveWorks project. How big is your text input? What happens when you type in something invalid? How are the different controls laid out on the screen? How about for a mobile device? UX and UI are terms that are often used together, but they have distinct meanings. A UI designer is focused on the specific design of the controls and layout of the product, where UX focuses on higher level concepts. Bringing it back to designing cars, this is the point where we are designing the door handles, the steering wheel, the dashboard, all the parts that the users interact with. Remember, with UX, we are focused on the experience as a whole. So why should we, as DriveWorks administrators, care about user experience? It's all about user adoption. You need people to actually use your configurator for it to be successful, and ease of use is the best way to attract and retain users. Not hitting that mark is the #1 reason for implementations to be unsuccessful. Just about all of us at some point in our life has built an automation tool we are really proud of, but no one ends up using it. It's frustrating. Later, we'll talk more about uncovering the needs of your users so you can focus your efforts there. This ties directly in with the next reason, planning. Planning can save time, money, and effort, and will make future efforts go smoother. Working in DriveWorks, we can sink a lot of time into trying to get something to work just right. How often is that time ultimately wasted because we did not have a clear understanding of what we were trying to accomplish? Maybe you fought with the oddities of making an HTML email quote, but your customer is frustrated because it can never print out right. Should you have made a PDF instead and attached it to a simple email? Maybe you stuck a ton of options into a single form, but your sales team or your customers could have told you that most of them are obsolete. It may not feel as productive up front, but ultimately it's easier and quicker to integrate the user experience into your planning. Believe me, the dividends will pay off later. Good designs leverage user intuition and past experiences. You can build on this by incorporating visuals, such as images or DriveWorks 3D Preview. Ultimately, good UX leads to having to take less of your valuable time training new users and less effort fixing things because users input invalid parameters. You could save yourself from having to reject specifications by not allowing invalid combinations. Catch errors before they happen and make it easy for the user to fix them. In some circumstances, a good UX can drive more sales as well. DriveWorks Live allows us to have configurators open to the public, not just for internal use. Doing so means our user base is larger, more diverse, and we have to compete with all the other sites out there. You can drive initial interest by having an attractive UI, but just like anything else, they won't come back unless they had a good experience. If you've had a configurator for a while, it's possible people have built up distrust or an ick factor. Introducing a new, better, more intuitive design is an opportunity for a marketing blast and a chance to re-engage customers that may have been frustrated with the old design. To recap, you should care about the user experience because a good UX attracts and retains users, saves time, money, and effort, and can lead to more sales, all affecting your bottom line. Before we jump into how to get started designing, I would like to take a moment to talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart: accessibility. Accessibility is the term for making sure that everyone can use your product, regardless of their abilities. We are not all perfect humans. Everyone has a different set of eyeballs, brain, hands, experience. If your implementation is public-facing, then folks will be accessing it from different browsers, devices, systems, and screen sizes. During the research phase, which we'll cover later, you will uncover which of these to focus on so you can accommodate those differences in your UI. Everyone benefits from accessibility. We are surrounded by technology or design decisions that, while they may be required for people with certain limitations, they are helpful for everyone. Take elevators, for instance. Here in the US, they were required by law by the Americans with Disability Act. That is the only way some folks can get from floor to floor. Curb cutting is the term for sloping a sidewalk down to a crossing, as seen here. This design decision shapes and guides you on where to cross the street, but it's also there to assist those confined to wheelchairs. Both elevators and curb cuts assist us all with our luggage, strollers, bikes, or even pulling a cart. Having large print and ensuring there is high contrast between text and its background vastly improves readability for everyone. When UX does not consider all users, shouldn't it be known as some user experience or sucks? Here are some key things you can do to make your DriveWorks implementation more accessible. Use large, easy-to-read fonts and make sure there's enough contrast between the text and the background. Make sure there's enough space between the elements so they don't run together. Don't rely on color alone to denote meaning. A majority of us in mechanical and manufacturing engineering are male, and we are 17 times more likely to be colorblind than women. Let's take a look at this interface. It's a simple form with a few inputs and some user validation. If we rely on the color of the border to determine valid input, not everyone may be able to tell if the input is valid or not. Here, we've modified it to include not only an icon, but also a text label telling the user what is wrong with the input. If you have a color picker for paint, make sure to include the color name, not just the color. We can consider making things accessible to those with dyslexia or ADHD by making sure there's ample space between elements and grouping like items together. Let's take a look at this interface from Microsoft Office. We have 3 sections of controls, each related to each other, labeled, grouped, and spaced out. Then there's a live preview of the changes you've made. There's too many controls to fit on a single page, so they've separated them into tabs. With this particular set of selections, one of the checkboxes is not available, and they've made it obvious by graying it out. This is an accessible, easy to follow design and not one that's difficult to implement in DriveWorks. We've learned about why UX and UI design are important and what they are. And we've discussed the importance of accessibility. Now, let's walk through the design process step by step. The design process occurs in a series of phases, each building on the last. We'll start by identifying, researching, and planning our project. Then we'll move on to conceptual design, wireframing, and prototyping. And we'll touch on some software that will help out with that. Once we have a design we're happy with, we'll move on to implementing it in DriveWorks. Along the way, we'll make sure to get feedback from stakeholders and users to make sure we are on the right track. And even once deployed, there's always room for improvement by collecting feedback. The very first step of UX design is the same step as in any project: identifying and prioritizing your goals, specifying your audience, and identifying the resources you have available. This will likely involve project managers or department heads, and is an exercise that you may have already done when you first started your DriveWorks implementation. First up is the goals. Define, if you haven't already, what it is that you wish to accomplish with your implementation or redesign. Ask yourself and your other stakeholders, what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to improve? We just covered many reasons to put effort into making a good UX, and many of them align with the reasons you got into DriveWorks in the first place. Probably to make your life easier, less repetitive, and ultimately to make your company more money. But which of these specifically applies to your company and your implementation? Can you quantify or qualify the improvements you wish to make? During this process, you may identify several goals, so now is the time to prioritize. We can't do everything at once, however much we wish we could. Identify which goals may be the easiest to implement or will have the biggest impact. Does it make sense to roll changes out incrementally, or should you do a complete redesign? Are these goals more important than what you or your team are currently working on? Next, identify who would be using your implementation. Will this be open to the general public or just your sales team? Will this be used by internal designers or administrators? Will you have anonymous users, or will everyone have to log in? Does it make sense to have different implementations for different users? Will you prioritize one group over another? You will likely use the groups you identify here as the basis for teams in DriveWorks security. You can't begin to plan unless you know which resources you have available. Who's going to be working on this project? Do they have the skills and time to do so? Do you need to get other departments in your company involved? Perhaps your marketing team has a graphic designer that can help with the design. Maybe your IT department can help with setting up a server or web hosting. Do you already know everything about the product, or do you need to get manufacturing and sales involved? Now, we've finished identifying our goals, audience, and resources. Our next step in the design journey is research. We need to find out more about our users, our competitors, and what alternatives are out there. In a previous phase, we, with our managerial hat on, identified the groups we wish to target. Now it is time to put on our detective hat and find out what we can about them. What are their motivations and goals in their role? What is their existing solution or workflow, and what challenges do they face with it? Based on this, we can focus our efforts on what will make the biggest impact for them, which will go a long way towards their willingness to adopt or keep up with the new solution. It may also be helpful to identify if they have any accessibility needs, what devices and browsers they are using, and what region, language, time zone, and currency they use. You will, of course, wish to take note of information you've gathered about your users. In UX design, sometimes it's helpful to create cards that represent your users, or user personas. Nice term to keep in your pocket if you end up working with a graphic designer. However, any way you can capture this information is just fine. Try and answer the question, why should they use your configurator? Your answer may be something along the lines of, it's an improvement over their existing solution because, or it will save them time, effort, and money because. This should tie in directly with the goals you identified earlier, but this time from the perspective of the user. Every designer, mechanical, UX, or otherwise, takes inspiration from what is already out there. See if you can find out what your competitors are using. Does it seem to work for them? Take some screenshots and, if you can, try them out. Read up on reviews or simply have a chat with someone who uses it. While researching your users, you've figured out what they're currently using. Look into that as well. If they're using your existing implementation, what are they saying about it? We don't want to throw them off the routine. Rather, we want to make it better. Less effort, more accessible, less errors or frustration. Before starting any project, it is important to have a plan, including a timeline, budget, and resource allocation. Are you going to make incremental changes or complete design? This likely depends on the goals you identified earlier and if there are items that need to be addressed immediately. You may have multiple people collaborating. Since only one person can have a project open in Administrator at a time, you may opt to separate the UI from the logic using specification host controls. Not only should you plan who on your team will be responsible for which parts, but you may bring in other departments such as marketing, graphic design, or IT, or even outsource some of the work. And of course, no plan is complete without a timeline and a budget. We have identified our goals, audience, and resources and have done our research. Now it's time to put it all together and start sketching up some ideas. This is the time for pencil and paper or a wipe-off board, even using scissors to cut out some of the screenshots you took. We are all familiar with the back of the napkin phase of invention or design, and this is pretty much that. Brainstorming is all about letting ideas flow quickly, not worrying about the details, and not letting your anxiety about the final product get in the way. Feel free to jump in and ideate or sketch on any ideas you have, whether it be the process as a whole, the form layout, or even the controls themselves. Spend a few minutes on each idea and then move on to the next. Once you're done, take a step back and see if any of the ideas stand out to you, or if you can combine them into something better. Now, we focus on the flow of the user through the implementation. Using technology you are comfortable with, make a high-level structure of the configurator. How do pages and forms interact with each other? What sources do they send or receive information from? Remember, map their experience, not just the pages. This means documenting what caused them to decide to use it in the first place, what software they may be accessing the link from, and what they expect to get in return, when. If different user groups have very different journeys, then you may wish to have different flow diagrams for each. User flow and user states are not that different from specification flow and states. In fact, many of these states may be the same: submitted for approval, awaiting for CAD, etc. Make sure to include your stakeholders in this process and iterate on the design as needed. Because of this need to collaborate and iterate, you may wish to use a software tool to help you with this process instead of relying on pen and paper. There are many options out there, and the importance is familiarity and stakeholder buy-in. So if you're using something already for diagramming your data flow or processes, use that. Ask around your company and see what you might have licenses for. You may already know and own PowerPoint, and that can work. But for more purpose-built tools, take a look at FigJam or Lucidchart, both of which have free tiers. Lucidchart is the industry leader for flow diagrams and is used by many companies for their design process. It has the most features and templates of any of these software, and it integrates with many professional services such as Salesforce and Microsoft Office. Your company may already have a license for it, so it's worth checking out. Figma is a design software we will take a look at later, and it has a tool called FigJam that is meant for real-time collaboration and mind mapping. If you are completely new to all of them, it may be easier to learn Figma and FigJam than Figma and some other software, and these two integrate well together. We have captured the user flow or journey. Now it is time to start visualizing the layout and functionality. We do this by making a wireframe. A wireframe is a low-fidelity mock-up of the various pages and controls. It is meant to be quick and easy to iterate on. It is not meant to be a final product, rather a way to quickly and easily visualize the layout and functionality of the configurator. Don't worry about colors, fonts, or even verbiage. Rather, focus on layout and functionality. Start by designing the overall layout of the configurator. This could be the header, sidebar, and main content. Then move on to the distinct pages or forms that the user will interact with. This could be the login or account creation page, the main configurator page, and the results page. It's fine at this point to leave the main content area blank or fill it with a placeholder like an X. Group controls into components as seen here, or like we saw with the Microsoft Office example. Try different layouts and groupings and get feedback from stakeholders. Capture this using whatever technology you are comfortable with. Moving groups of controls around in software is trivial, but if you are hand drawing it, you may wish to cut them out with scissors and move them around physically. Some people start with pen and paper to capture their thoughts, then move to a digital tool for more polished versions. This is an example of a hand-drawn wireframe draft of a single page. And here are a few pages mocked up in Figma. This could also have been made in any other design software, like Adobe XD, InDesign, Publisher, or even PowerPoint. I gently advise against using raster software like Photoshop or Paint, but if that's what you're comfortable with, then go for it. You can even use DriveWorks Form Designer if it's easier than learning a new software. Just remember, we are focusing on making a low-fidelity mock-up, not a final product. For your wireframe and prototype, which we'll discuss momentarily, you may wish to use a purpose-built tool like Figma or Adobe XD. Figma is an industry leader for UX design and is used by many companies for their design processes. It allows you to quickly iterate through ideas, focus on design while isolating from the minutiae of implementation, and it excels at collaboration. You can have multiple people work on it at once, unlike DriveWorks Form Designer, and you can capture comments right on the design. We'll talk more about its ability to make interactive prototypes in the next section. There's a free tier, it's easy to learn and use, and there's tons of free tutorials from both their site and YouTube. Once we and our stakeholders are happy with the wireframe, it's time to make a prototype. A prototype is a high-fidelity mock-up of the various pages and controls. It's meant to be the last stop before implementation. Just like making a mechanical prototype, this is meant to be a representation of the final product in order to test it out. As such, using a purpose-built tool is recommended. Figma and Adobe XD are industry leaders, but if needed, InDesign, Publisher, Photoshop, or even PowerPoint can be used. When making the wireframe, we focused on layout and function. We may have used X's or other placeholders to represent content, or we may have had a draft version. With the prototype, we're making a full, high-fidelity mock-up of our site, which will be used as the basis for the final product. Now is the time to marry in the branding, colors, fonts, and to finalize our content and verbiage. The flow diagram, wireframe, and even the user persona were meant to quickly ideate and iterate rather than needing to be polished. This prototype is meant to be polished and signed off by stakeholders. This is similar to an engineering drawing, the full specification of the product, but not the product itself. Most companies have a branding guide, such as this one, that specifies the colors, fonts, logos, and typography that should be used in any marketing material. We should reach out to them and get a copy of it for us to follow, as well as any other design guidelines they may have. If we're working in Figma or Adobe XD, we can make a master for each component and use that master throughout the design. This way, if we need to change the color of a button, for example, we can do it in one place and it will update everywhere. When it's time to implement, we can pull the sizing and styling from there. Now, you're ready to put it all together. For each page that is distinctly different, make a page in Figma or the software of your choice. If you identified that your users will be accessing this from different devices, make sure to make a prototype for each of these devices. Before you show your stakeholder, make sure it's clear how a user would navigate from one page to another. PowerPoint obviously has a function that allows you to go through pages like a slideshow, but if you use something like Figma, you can link buttons together to navigate the different pages. That prototype can be shared with others using a link, including the interactive prototype. The less your testers have to think about how to navigate, the more they can focus on the design itself and provide accurate feedback. Take this feedback and iterate on the design. Once you have a design that everyone is happy with, be sure to export it as a PDF and get a sign-off, whether this is literal or just a confirmation email. This is it, the final step. It's time to implement everything you've designed. Use your component guide to make a form that has an example of each of the items or groups you need. This way, you can set any properties here and simply copy and paste when you need a new one. You can find an example of this in the responsive form template from DriveWorks. Use variables wherever possible to keep things consistent. If you set the standard width of a control via a variable, you can edit it from anywhere, as opposed to having to find the original control and changing that. You may wish to set your brand colors and fonts in either CSS variables or DriveWorks variables. This makes it easier for others to contribute and not have to train them on your brand guidelines. Remember those groupings you made during the prototype phase? These can become frame controls in DriveWorks. This way, you can group controls together and move them around as a single unit. If you're using DriveWorks 21 or newer, you can use CSS to style your components. This allows for way more customization than DriveWorks alone and can be used to match your brand guidelines. It can also allow advanced styling, such as animations, shadows, or hover effects. Don't set the positions of the controls in CSS. As a general rule, all of the functionality of the forms should work with CSS disabled. However, with CSS, you can make it a nicer or more modern user experience. If your application will be available via the web, make sure to test it on different devices and browsers. Test it against a small group of users and get feedback before rolling it out to everyone. Even when you do publish it, your job is not quite done. You can always take feedback and improve. More objectively, the goal of this exercise was to make things better for your users. And how do you know if you've done that if you don't ask them? You can collect feedback and use it to decide what to change next and how, making sure you stay true to your objectives, priorities, and principles. And that's our journey from cradle to grave. We started by identifying our goals, audience, and priorities. We researched our users and competitors. We created a plan and a timeline to follow. We brainstormed and doodled up some ideas. Then we wireframed the different pages and controls. Using software such as Figma, we made a prototype that would be the blueprint for our implementation. Lastly, we implemented our design in DriveWorks, making use of variables and new features such as CSS. Now that it's out in the wild, we can collect feedback and never stop improving. Thank you all for attending this virtual session at DriveWorks World 2024. I hope you learned a lot about accessibility, UX and UI design, why they're important, and how to get started. Don't forget to check out all the other sessions in the DriveWorks World event app.